She was standing in a parlor in 1953 when Eleanore King placed two fingers between her shoulder blades and said quietly, "There she is." Posture was the invisible architecture of feminine authority, and almost every woman alive then knew exactly how to build it. Post-war America was a society that had just survived two catastrophic decades, the Depression and the War, and it came out the other side with a fierce, almost desperate hunger for order. The way a home looked, the way a table was set, the way a woman carried herself through a room, none of it was accidental. These were the visible signs that civilization had held, that the center had not given way, and that the women keeping those homes were equal to the task of rebuilding something worth living in. If you have ever looked at a photograph from the 1950s and noticed something you could not quite name, a quality in the way the women stood, the way they occupied a room without taking up too much of it, and yet somehow commanding all of it, you were seeing something real. Women then carried themselves differently, not stiffly, not artificially, but with a physical ease that looked almost effortless. The question worth asking is a simple one. Why? What did they know that we have completely forgotten how to teach? Here is the first thing to understand, and it matters more than anything else in this story. That posture was not natural. It was not something women in the 1950s simply had because life was simpler or clothing was more structured. It was trained into them, deliberately, systematically, and over the course of many years, beginning when they were small children sitting at school desks. The poise you see in those old photographs was the end product of a relentless, decades-long education in how a body should move through the world. Picture a public school classroom in 1913. The desks are slanted at a precise angle, the benches have no backs, and the teacher is moving slowly between the rows. She is not checking arithmetic. She is checking spines. A child who rounds her shoulders receives a correction. A child who slumps forward gets a quiet tap on the upper back. This was a graded exercise, as formal and as serious as spelling or penmanship, and it happened every single day. The children in that room grew up to be the mothers and grandmothers of the 1950s. From 1913 through the 1950s, a span of more than 40 years, posture training was a mandatory part of the American public school curriculum. Students were graded on how they sat and how they stood. This was not a suggestion tucked into a health pamphlet. It was a formal academic requirement, evaluated by teachers who had themselves been trained to assess the position of a child's spine, shoulders, and chin. 40 years of mandatory instruction is long enough to turn a social expectation into something that feels like second nature. That is exactly what happened. The architecture of the classroom itself was designed to enforce upright sitting. Slanted desks, canted at a precise angle, were standard equipment in American schools from the late 1800s onward. The slope pushed the student's writing surface toward them, which naturally encouraged an upright trunk rather than a forward hunch. Backless benches went one step further. Without a backrest to lean against, a child had only two choices: sit up straight using her own muscles or slouch and feel it immediately. The furniture was doing half the teaching before the teacher said a word. What did it actually feel like to be a child inside that system? Think about your own school day, and then remove the padded chair, the adjustable desk, and the permission to shift your weight whenever you liked. In those classrooms, physical correction was a daily routine, as unremarkable as being asked to speak up when answering a question. A teacher's hand on your shoulder blade was not a punishment. It was instruction. Children absorbed it the way they absorbed everything else at that age, as simply the way things were, the way the world worked, the way a person was supposed to be. By the 1930s, the stakes of posture had risen well beyond the physical. Slouching was no longer simply seen as a careless habit of the body. It had become a moral category, a visible sign of weak character, poor self-discipline, and a failure of the will. A woman who rounded her shoulders in public was not just making a physical mistake. She was broadcasting something about who she was on the inside. This fusion of physical bearing and moral worth ran deep in American culture, and it gave the posture correction of the era an urgency that a purely aesthetic standard never could have produced. Physical educator Jessie Bancroft was one of the most influential voices in American posture culture in the early 20th century, and she made an argument that resonated far beyond gymnasiums and schoolrooms. Bancroft championed the idea that upright posture did not merely improve the body, it elevated a person's efficiency and spirits to a loftier plane. That phrase is worth sitting with. She was not talking about a straighter spine as a medical outcome. She was talking about posture as a gateway to a better self, a higher functioning, a more capable and more dignified human being. That idea caught fire. Then the 1940s arrived, and posture acquired a new and powerful framing: patriotism. During the war years, a strong, upright citizenry was not just a personal virtue, it was a national asset. Health propaganda posters and school materials of the era made the connection explicit. A straight spine was the spine of a nation that was not going to bend. A slouching population was a weakened population. For women on the home front, holding themselves well was folded into the same category as growing a victory garden or conserving tin. It was a contribution to something larger than themselves. Here is something that almost nobody talks about when they discuss 1950s posture. The standard itself did not originate with women at all. The precise plumb-line definition of perfect posture, a straight vertical line drawn through the ear, the shoulder, the hip, and the ankle, was originally derived from early 20th century measurements of male military soldiers standing at attention. Researchers studying how soldiers held themselves at drill developed that geometric standard, and it became the clinical benchmark that eventually migrated into every charm school checklist and every school posture grading rubric in America. The translation of that soldier's drill posture into a feminine etiquette standard is one of the quieter cultural migrations of the early 20th century. Nobody announced it. There was no formal decree that said the way a man stands at attention will now become the way a woman enters a parlor. It happened gradually, through the language of health educators, through the illustrations in women's magazines, through the posture charts that schools used for grading. By the time it arrived in the 1950s charm school studio, it had been so thoroughly domesticated that it no longer felt military at all. It felt like grace. The rule was specific and geometric. Ear, shoulder, hip, and ankle were to align in one unbroken vertical line when a woman stood. Not approximately, not roughly. A straight line, as precise as a plumb bob hanging from a ceiling. Charm school instructors used actual plumb lines, a weighted string hung from a fixed point, to check whether a student's body met the standard. If any of those 4 points drifted forward or backward, the posture was wrong, regardless of how comfortable it felt. The body was being asked to conform to a geometric ideal, and the training was the process of making that conformity feel natural. By the time the 1950s arrived, something important had happened to posture as a cultural idea. The military stiffness had been quietly sanded away. The wartime urgency had softened. What remained was something more refined and, in many ways, more demanding: posture as the ultimate expression of feminine grace. It was no longer about discipline or patriotism, or even health in any clinical sense. It was about how a woman moved through the world, whether she looked like someone worth receiving, someone whose presence in a room elevated the room. That shift from duty to elegance is what made 1950s posture so distinctive. The post-war charm school boom was remarkable in its scale. Hundreds of schools opened across America in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, offering courses to homemakers, secretaries, young women preparing for marriage, and anyone who wanted to move through polite society with confidence. These were not finishing schools in the old European sense. They were practical, accessible, and marketed directly to the post-war American woman who understood that how she presented herself in a room had real social consequences. Poise was not a luxury, it was a skill, and these schools sold it as such. Eleanore King was one of the most sought-after charm school coaches of her era, and the women who came to her studio described themselves, almost without exception, as awkward. They were homemakers who felt uncomfortable at their husbands' company dinners. They were young women who did not know what to do with their hands when they entered a room. King took them through a process that was part physical training and part quiet confidence building, and the women who completed it described a transformation that went well beyond how they looked. They said they felt different. They said they finally understood how to be present in a room. King's posture checklist was precise enough to be taught, but subtle enough to feel personal. Hips tucked gently under the body, not thrust back, not tilted forward, but gathered beneath the spine in a way that stabilized the entire frame. Chin perfectly parallel to the floor, not lifted in pride, not dropped in shyness, but level, as if an invisible thread connected it to the far wall. And then the final test, the one that separated genuine poise from performed stiffness. The body weight had to be so evenly balanced that the student could freely wiggle her toes inside her shoes. If she could do that, she had it. The toe wiggling test sounds almost whimsical until you understand what it was actually measuring. If a woman was gripping the floor with her toes, which is exactly what the body does when it is compensating for poor balance or hidden tension, she could not wiggle them freely. The test was a diagnostic tool disguised as a charming detail. It revealed whether the posture was genuine or performed, whether the body was truly at ease in its alignment or quietly straining to maintain an appearance of ease. True poise in King's framework was a state the body arrived at, not a position it was forced into. Here is the part that surprises people most when they first learn it. Looking stiff was considered just as much of a failure as slouching in mid-century charm school culture. The women who arrived at those studios having overcorrected, pulling their shoulders back so hard their chest jutted forward, lifting their chins so high they looked imperious, were corrected just as firmly as the women who came in slumping. The goal was never rigidity. The goal was alignment that looked so natural, so completely uncontrived, that no one in the room could have identified the effort behind it. That was the real standard, and it was the hardest one to meet. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. You had to look perfectly straight and utterly relaxed at the same time. Not stiff, not studied, not as though you had spent the last 20 minutes practicing in front of your bedroom mirror, which of course you had. The achievement was in making the effort invisible. That was the whole point. Effortlessness was the standard, and effortlessness was the hardest thing in the world to perform convincingly. Charm school coaches in the 1950s had a phrase they repeated to every new student who came through the door, gripping her handbag a little too tightly and holding her shoulders a little too high. Do not give us the exaggerated posture of a Marine. That was the warning. Military rigidity was not the goal. A woman standing at attention looked anxious, even aggressive. What the coaches wanted was something far more difficult to achieve and far more powerful to behold. They wanted grace, composure, authority that asked for nothing and commanded everything. The technique the coaches actually taught was about releasing tension from specific places while holding it invisibly in others. The shoulders had to drop, the jaw had to unclench, the hands had to rest without gripping, but the core, the deep muscles along the spine, those had to hold everything in place without anyone in the room ever suspecting they were working at all. It was, in the most literal sense, a performance, a highly trained, socially mandatory performance that post-war women were expected to give every single time they left their bedroom. Picture a parlor in 1955. 6 women seated on upholstered chairs, teacups balanced, conversation flowing. The door opens. A seventh woman enters. She does not announce herself. She does not hurry. She pauses for just a moment in the doorway, chin level, shoulders settled, weight distributed evenly across both feet. Every woman in that room registers what they are seeing before a single word is exchanged. Not her dress, not her hair, not her jewelry. Her carriage, her posture speaks before she does, and it says everything about who she is and whether she belongs in this room. Posture was the first social signal in any room, and it arrived before your name, before your voice, before anyone had decided whether to like you. In post-war American social life, the first few seconds of a woman's physical entrance into a space were loaded with information that every other woman present was quietly reading and filing away. It was not cruel. It was not superficial. It was a shared language that every well-raised woman of the era had been trained since childhood to both speak and understand fluently. What posture communicated in that world was not vanity. It communicated class in the truest sense of the word, meaning self-possession, not wealth. It communicated self-respect, the signal that you valued your own presence enough to present it carefully. And it communicated readiness, the unspoken message that you were composed, capable, and prepared to be received by company. A woman who entered a room upright and unhurried was telling everyone present that she was in command of herself. And in 1950s social life, that was the most important thing a woman could say. The moral judgment attached to poor posture in the post-war era was not subtle, and it was not kind. A woman who slouched was not seen as tired or uncomfortable. She was seen as someone who lacked the self-discipline to hold herself together. It was read as laziness of character, not laziness of muscle. The body, in the social logic of the 1950s, was a direct expression of the inner person. If you could not be bothered to sit up straight in company, what else could you not be bothered to do? The spine was a moral barometer, and everyone in the room was reading it. There is a persistent misconception about why 1950s women sat so beautifully, and it usually involves foundation garments. The girdle did it, people say. The corset held them up. The undergarments did the work so the women did not have to. It is a tidy explanation, and it is mostly wrong. Foundation garments were certainly part of the post-war wardrobe, and they did provide some physical structure. But the women who wore them had also been sitting upright in school since they were 6 years old, corrected by teachers, corrected by mothers, corrected by the very chairs they sat in. The girdle was the finishing touch, not the foundation. The reality was that good posture in the 1950s was deeply learned muscle memory built over decades of physical correction that began in childhood and was reinforced every single day by social pressure, school architecture, and the watchful eyes of other women. By the time a post-war homemaker walked into a parlor in 1955, her upright carriage was not something she was consciously performing. It was simply how her body had learned to be in the world. The training had become the body. That is a very different thing from a garment that holds you up and then comes off at the end of the evening. There is a meaningful difference between a body that is mechanically supported and a body that has been trained. A corseted body stands upright because something outside it is holding the shape. A trained body stands upright because the muscles themselves have been taught over years to hold that position without being asked. Remove the corset and the first body collapses. The trained body does not collapse because the training has become structural. The post-war homemaker's posture lived in her muscles, her habits, her reflexes. It was hers in a way that no garment could replicate and no garment could take away. Now picture this. A young woman in 1956 standing on a stage at a chiropractic convention. She is wearing a lovely vintage dress and a composed, polished smile. Beside her stands a literal plumb line, a weighted string dropped from ceiling to floor, marking the perfect vertical. Judges in white coats are observing the alignment of her ear, her shoulder, her hip, her ankle. She is not being judged on her talent or her wit. She is being judged on the geometry of her spine. This was the Miss Perfect Posture pageant, and it was entirely real. The Miss Perfect Posture and Miss Perfect Spine pageants were judged with a seriousness that would seem extraordinary today. Contestants were evaluated on the precise plumb-line straightness of their carriage, meaning the degree to which their ear, shoulder, hip, and ankle fell along a single vertical axis when viewed from the side. It was not enough to look poised. The geometry had to be correct. Judges used trained observation and physical measurement to assess spinal symmetry. The women who won these pageants were held up as the living standard of what American health and beauty looked like in the post-war era. Perhaps the most striking detail of these pageants is that some of them used X-rays as judging criteria. Spinal symmetry was not merely observed from the outside, it was measured from the inside. A contestant's vertebral alignment could be examined radiographically and compared against the ideal standard. The spine itself was a beauty criterion. This was the moment when post-war American culture fused health, aesthetics, and social status into a single standard. And that standard was the perfectly aligned female spine. It sounds extreme now. At the time, it was considered the height of scientific modernity. These pageants peaked around 1956, which places them squarely in the golden era of post-war poise. They were not fringe events. They were hosted by chiropractors, attended by community members, covered in local newspapers, and treated as legitimate celebrations of female health and beauty. The timing matters. By 1956, the post-war charm school boom was in full swing, the homemaker ideal was at its cultural apex, and the idea that a woman's physical carriage was both a health marker and a social credential had been building for nearly 4 decades of mandatory school posture training. The pageants were the logical conclusion of all of it. Here is the part that the pageant programs did not advertise. The Miss Perfect Posture competitions were not purely a celebration of feminine health. They were a calculated marketing strategy by early chiropractors who were working hard to legitimize their relatively new profession and attract patients to their clinics. Chiropractic care in the 1950s was still fighting for mainstream medical credibility. Hosting a beauty pageant that put spinal health at the center of public attention was a brilliant piece of public relations. It made the spine interesting. It made spinal alignment aspirational. And it put chiropractors in the position of the experts who could get you there. What the Miss Perfect Posture pageants reveal, when you step back and look at them clearly, is how completely health, beauty, and social status had been fused together in post-war American culture. A woman who stood correctly was not just healthy. She was beautiful. She was respectable. She was the kind of woman whose company you sought and whose household you admired. These 3 things, physical health, physical beauty, and social standing, had been woven into a single standard, and that standard was expressed through the body, through posture, through the way a woman held herself in a room full of other people who were quietly keeping score. Educators and health advocates of the 1950s believed, with genuine conviction, that good posture did far more than make a woman look composed. They believed it improved circulation. They believed it aided digestion. They believed it expanded lung capacity and produced better breathing. These were not fringe claims. They were taught in schools, promoted by physical educators, and repeated in the popular press. The upright body was presented to post-war homemakers as a kind of domestic health technology, something a woman could practice every day in her own parlor that would make her stronger, healthier, and more vital. It is important to be clear about what we are describing here. These were the health claims of the era. Educators at the time believed them. They were marketed to post-war homemakers as settled science. They appeared in school curricula, in charm school programs, in popular magazines, and on the stages of chiropractic pageants. But belief is not the same as proof, and the enthusiasm with which these claims were repeated does not make them accurate. The women who accepted them were not foolish. They were working with the information available to them in their time, the same way every generation does. Here is the modern verdict, stated plainly. Rigid plumb-line posture is not required for spinal health. Modern physical therapists and osteopaths, working with the best available clinical evidence as of 2024 and 2026, have confirmed that the mid-century posture standard does not hold up as a medical necessity. There is no strong clinical evidence that maintaining one specific perfect posture prevents back pain or protects the spine over a lifetime. The post-war posture paradigm was a cultural and aesthetic standard that was dressed in the language of medicine. The medicine has moved on. The culture, unfortunately, moved on too, and took the grace with it. Modern physical therapists are specific about what the old paradigm got wrong. Human bodies are not uniform. Some people have naturally flat backs. Some have sway backs. Some have spines that curve in ways that are simply the architecture they were born with, and forcing those bodies into a single universal plumb-line standard is not therapeutic. It can actually create tension and discomfort in bodies that were not built for that particular geometry. The 1950s posture standard was derived from measurements of male military soldiers standing at attention, applied to women's bodies, and then marketed as universal truth. It was never universal. It was a template borrowed from the drill yard. Here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and where the women of the 1950s deserve more credit than history usually gives them. Human spines are not uniform. A woman with a naturally flat back and a woman with a pronounced lumbar curve are built differently, and no single plumb line drawn through the ear, shoulder, hip, and ankle was ever going to fit both of them with equal grace. The post-war posture standard was derived from measurements of male military recruits, applied universally to women of every body type, and presented as biological fact. It was not. It was a cultural construction dressed in the language of anatomy. So, medicine moved on. By the late 20th century, physical therapists had quietly retired the plumb-line ideal and replaced it with something more nuanced: movement, variation, and the understanding that no single static position defines a healthy spine. That part of the 1950s posture story is genuinely outdated, and it needed to go. But here is the distinction that almost nobody makes anymore. The medical verdict on rigid posture has absolutely no bearing on the social power that Poise still carries in any room. Those are two entirely separate conversations, and conflating them is how we lost something real. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. Walk into any room today and watch what happens when a woman enters with her chin level, her shoulders settled, and her weight carried with quiet intention. Every head turns. Not because she is dressed expensively or speaking loudly, but because her physical presence signals something that the room registers before a single conscious thought forms. That signal is authority. It is the oldest social currency there is, and it costs nothing except the willingness to carry yourself as though you belong exactly where you are standing. Post-war homemakers did not arrive at this level of poise by accident, and they certainly did not maintain it by thinking about it consciously every waking hour. They practiced, not in the dramatic, deliberate way of a charm school session, but in the small daily rituals woven into the fabric of an ordinary morning. A woman would check her posture in the hallway mirror before answering the door. She would straighten before picking up the telephone receiver, because the habit of composure did not switch off simply because the caller could not see her. The body remembered what the mind had long since stopped consciously directing. The most powerful posture instructor most women ever had was not a charm school coach. It was their mother. Posture was transmitted the way all the deepest etiquette was transmitted in post-war America, not through formal instruction, but through daily correction, quiet example, and the particular tone of voice a mother used when she said your name from across the room. No lecture was required. A single glance, a slight lift of the chin in the direction of a slouching daughter, communicated everything. This was the living curriculum that no textbook recorded and no classroom replicated, passed down at kitchen tables and Sunday dinner tables for decades. Picture a Sunday morning in 1952. Company is coming at 2 o'clock. The roast is in the oven, the good china is already set, and a mother is standing in the doorway of her daughter's bedroom with an expression that requires no explanation. The daughter straightens, not because she was told to in that moment, but because she has been told to every Sunday before this one, and the correction has long since become anticipation. By the time the guests arrived, the daughter's posture was not performance. It was preparation, the physical act of signaling readiness to be seen, to be received, to represent the household with grace. The dinner table was not merely where the family ate, it was the daily training ground for every physical habit that mattered in public. Chair height relative to table height was not a casual arrangement. The table was meant to sit at roughly elbow height when a woman was seated upright, which meant her forearms could rest lightly on the edge without her rounding her shoulders forward to reach the plate. The spine stayed long because the furniture demanded it. The post-war American dining room was, in its quiet way, a piece of corrective architecture that nobody ever had to explain because the room itself did the explaining. There were two distinct posture standards in a well-run post-war household, and confusing them was a social error that the observant women in the room would register immediately. At the dining table, the standard was functional uprightness, spine long, shoulders back, forearms available for the business of eating with composure. In the parlor chair, the standard shifted. A parlor chair was deeper, softer, and more welcoming, and the woman seated in it was expected to occupy it with a kind of settled elegance, not perched anxiously at the edge, not collapsed into the cushions, but arranged with visible ease. The distinction mattered because each setting communicated something different about the woman's self-possession. Crossing your legs at the knee was a social statement in 1950s America, and not always a flattering one. The approved posture for a seated woman in polite company was ankles crossed and feet placed slightly to one side, a position that kept the lines of the skirt or dress clean and communicated composure without restlessness. Crossing at the knee was considered acceptable in some circles, but carried a slight edge of informality, and in more traditional parlors it was quietly discouraged. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. The ankles told the room whether you had been taught and whether it had taken. Lowering yourself into a chair was a choreographed act in mid-century charm school culture, and Eleanore King taught it as precisely as any dance step. You approached the chair from the front, stopped when the back of your calf made light contact with the seat edge, then lowered yourself by bending at the knees while keeping the spine entirely vertical. You did not reach back for the armrests. You did not lean forward and drop. You descended in one controlled, unhurried movement that communicated absolute certainty about where the chair was and absolute ease about the act of sitting in it. The woman who did it correctly looked as though she had never given it a moment's thought. Rising from a chair was, if anything, the more demanding of the two movements, because it was the moment when the temptation to push off the armrests was almost irresistible. Charm school coaches taught women to resist it entirely. The correct technique was to slide forward on the seat until the weight shifted over the feet, then rise using only the legs, keeping the spine straight and the chin level throughout. The hands remained in the lap or moved gracefully to the skirt as the woman stood. Pushing off the armrests was considered ungainly, a visible sign that the body had not been trained to carry itself without assistance. The woman who rose cleanly from a chair announced without a word that she had been taught. Entering a room was its own complete performance, and it was the one that charm school coaches spent the most time on because it was the moment that could not be undone. A woman crossed the threshold, paused for exactly one composed beat, and allowed the room to register her arrival before she moved toward anyone. not a dramatic pause, not a hesitation born of uncertainty. A settled pause, the physical equivalent of a period at the end of a sentence. Her chin was level, her shoulders were down, and her gaze moved across the room with quiet confidence rather than darting from face to face. In that single beat at the doorway, every woman present formed her first and most durable impression. Walking posture had its own precise vocabulary in the mid-century charm school tradition. The heel met the floor first, followed by a smooth roll through the ball of the foot, and the step was placed with the feet tracking in a line close together rather than wide apart. The arms hung naturally and moved with the body in a slight, easy swing, never crossed over the stomach and never held stiffly at the sides. The gaze line was the detail that most women got wrong before they were trained. The eyes were to remain level with the horizon, not directed at the floor in front of the feet. A woman who watched the floor while she walked announced, without intending to, that she was not entirely sure of her welcome. The book on the head exercise has become the single most recognizable image from 1950s charm school culture, so recognizable that it has almost become a joke. That is a shame, because what it actually trained was more sophisticated than simple balance. A book balanced on the crown of the head does not stay there if the chin tips down or the spine curves forward. It requires the neck to be long, the chin to be level, and the entire upper spine to be stacked with genuine alignment rather than a performance of it. The exercise gave the body immediate, unambiguous feedback. There was no arguing with a book that slid off the head. The correction was instant, honest, and required no instructor to deliver it. Picture the hallway of a charm school in 1954. The walls are pale, the floor is polished to a high shine, and a line of women in shirtwaist dresses is making its way slowly from one end to the other with hardcover books balanced on their heads. Some are the wives of returning veterans. Some are young women preparing for their first serious social season. One is a homemaker in her late 30s who told the intake coordinator she had always felt awkward in company and was tired of feeling that way. None of them are looking down. That is the first rule and the hardest one. The book will tell you immediately if you forget it, and the hallway is long enough that forgetting is not an option. The chin parallel to the floor rule was not arbitrary elegance, it was structural. When the chin is level, the eyes face forward, the neck sits naturally over the spine, and the entire column of the upper body organizes itself around that single alignment point. Charm school coaches understood this intuitively, even if they described it in the language of grace rather than anatomy. But the social consequence of the rule was just as important as the physical one. A level chin meant a level gaze, and a level gaze, in any room, in any decade, communicates the same thing. I am present, I am composed, and I am not apologizing for being here. A downcast gaze in 1950s social culture communicated a specific set of things, and none of them were flattering. It suggested timidity. It suggested a woman who was not entirely sure she deserved to be in the room. It could suggest embarrassment, or worse, a kind of social apology for one's own presence. A level gaze communicated the opposite. It said that the woman had arrived with intention, that she was prepared to be seen, and that she expected to be received with the same respect she was extending to the room. This was not arrogance. The distinction between a confident level gaze and an imperious one was something charm school coaches spent considerable time on, because getting it wrong in either direction was its own kind of social failure. Standing posture at a social event carried its own set of rules distinct from seated posture, and a woman who had been properly trained moved between the two without visible adjustment. While standing and speaking with guests, the weight was distributed evenly across both feet, with one foot placed very slightly ahead of the other to create a natural, stable line through the body. The hips remained level. The shoulders stayed down and back without any visible effort to hold them there. A woman who stood correctly at a party looked, to the untrained eye, as though she had simply never learned to stand any other way. That was exactly the point. The training was meant to be invisible, and when it worked, it was. The hands were not a footnote in mid-century posture training. They were the detail that completed the picture or ruined it. While standing, the hands rested at the sides in a relaxed, natural position, neither clasped tightly in front nor shoved into pockets nor fidgeting with jewelry or clothing. While seated, they rested in the lap with the fingers loosely together, or held a teacup with the handle between the thumb and index finger and the remaining fingers curved beneath, never splayed outward. While listening to another person speak, the hands were still. Stillness of the hands was understood as the physical expression of genuine attention, the visible proof that the woman was fully present in the conversation and not already composing her reply. There was a belief in mid-century charm school culture, passed along by coaches like Eleanore King, that posture and voice were connected in a way that went beyond mere appearance. Educators at the time believed that a woman who sat or stood with an open, upright chest produced a fuller, warmer vocal tone than one who was rounded forward and compressed. Whether or not modern vocal coaches would frame it in precisely those terms, the practical observation was not entirely without foundation. A compressed chest restricts the breath, and restricted breath flattens the voice. The post-war woman who had been trained to carry herself with an open posture was, without knowing it, also being trained to speak with more presence. The body and the voice were never separate instruments. Something shifted in the American living room around 1970, and it did not happen all at once. It happened sofa by sofa, chair by chair. The furniture industry had been quietly redesigning the American home since the late 1950s, and by the early 1970s, the deep-seated, heavily cushioned sofa had become the centerpiece of middle-class comfort. You sank into it. That was the point. And when you sank into it, every muscle that 3 decades of post-war training had carefully built simply switched off. The deep-seated sofa was not just a piece of furniture. It was a cultural statement. It said that comfort had finally won. After decades of wartime sacrifice and post-war striving, the American family had earned the right to slouch. Furniture designers marketed these pieces on exactly that promise. You were no longer in a parlor where company might arrive and judge your carriage. You were in a family room, and the family room had different rules. Or rather, it had no rules at all. Composure gave way to comfort, and nobody wrote an obituary for what was lost. Then came the office chair, and then came the screen. The ergonomic office chair of the 1980s was designed with good intentions, but it solved the posture problem by removing the need for the body to solve it independently. Lumbar support replaced trained muscle memory, and when personal computers arrived on desks in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the gaze that mid-century charm schools had worked so hard to keep level and forward dropped permanently downward toward a glowing rectangle. The posture that had taken generations to build was erased in less than one. What was lost when posture stopped being taught was not simply a physical habit. It was an entire social language that had no other way of being spoken. Posture was how a woman communicated before she opened her mouth. It told the room whether she was composed or uncertain, whether she expected to be received well or was already apologizing for her presence. When that language disappeared from the curriculum, from the charm school, from the dinner table correction, it did not get replaced. The room just went quiet in a way that nobody quite noticed. Posture was the invisible architecture. That phrase matters. Architecture does not announce itself. You do not walk into a well-designed room and think about the load-bearing walls. You simply feel that the space holds together, that it has dignity, that it was built with intention. Posture worked exactly the same way inside every social interaction. It was the structure that made everything else. The conversation, the greeting, the handshake, the entrance feel coherent and purposeful. Remove the architecture and the room does not collapse dramatically. It just slowly loses its shape. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. She knew that how you hold your body in a room is not a vanity. It is a declaration. It tells every person present whether you intend to be taken seriously. She did not read that in a book. She learned it at a school desk that forced her upright, at a dinner table where her mother's hand appeared on her shoulder without a word, in a charm school hallway with a copy of the Farmer's Almanac balanced on her head. It was in her body before it was ever in her mind. That is precisely why it worked. Here is the part that is worth sitting with for a moment. When the medical community in the 1970s and beyond began questioning whether rigid upright posture was truly the healthiest physical position, they were right to question it. Modern physical therapists, as of 2024 and 2026, confirm that the Plumb-Line Standard was never the medical necessity it was marketed as. But somewhere in that entirely reasonable correction, the social power of Poise got thrown out along with the outdated health claims. We fixed the science and lost the etiquette. That is the baby out with the bathwater problem, and nobody noticed it happening. What modern women in 2026 have lost cannot be recovered simply by deciding to sit up straighter this afternoon. That is the hard truth of it. The posture that mid-century women carried was not a position. It was a practice that had been layered into the body over years, beginning in a school desk at age 6, reinforced at every dinner table and parlor visit and charm school session for decades after. It lived in the muscles and the habits and the social expectations of an entire culture. You cannot recover that in an afternoon, but you can begin to understand what it was and why it mattered. There is a difference between performing posture and embodying it, and the women of the 1950s understood that difference intuitively, even if they never articulated it in those words. Performing posture is what you do when you remember to sit up straight during a job interview. Embodying it is what happens when the uprightness is so deeply trained that it requires no conscious thought at all, when it is simply how you exist in a room. The charm school coaches were not teaching a trick. They were building a second nature. That is why the posture of those women looked effortless, because for them, it genuinely was. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore. Posture is only the beginning of it. The way a woman entered a room, the way she lowered herself into a chair, the way she held her hands while listening, the way her gaze stayed level and forward in any company, these were not decorative flourishes. They were a complete and coherent social vocabulary. Each gesture connected to the next. Each rule reinforced the others. It was a system, carefully built over generations, and it was dismantled so gradually that most people alive today have never even seen it whole. What can you take from all of this? Not a rigid set of rules to perform self-consciously in modern company. That would miss the point entirely. What you can take is an awareness, a quiet recalibration of what physical presence still communicates in any room you walk into. The women of the 1950s were not trying to look impressive. They were simply living inside a set of values that said your body in space is part of how you speak to the world. That awareness does not require a charm school. It requires only the decision to enter a room as if you intend to be there. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. The women who carried these codes deserve to be remembered as intentional, not merely obedient. That distinction matters deeply. It is easy to look back at the post-war homemaker and see only compliance, a woman shaped by social pressure into a form that suited the era. But the evidence tells a more complicated and more respectful story. These women studied, they practiced. They chose, within the options available to them, to master a set of skills that commanded genuine respect in every room they entered. The poise was not imposed on them from outside. It was built from inside, one correction at a time, until it became entirely their own. Posture was never just about the spine. That is the thing the medical debate always missed. The chiropractors with their plumb lines and their Miss Perfect posture pageants were measuring the wrong thing, and the modern physical therapists who corrected them were also measuring the wrong thing. Because posture was not primarily a medical matter, it was a social one. It was about claiming space with quiet authority. It was about walking into a room and communicating without a single word that you had prepared yourself to be present, that you respected the company you were entering, and that you expected to be received accordingly. That is what was lost, and it is worth mourning. If any of this brought back a memory, a mother's hand on your shoulder at the dinner table, a teacher walking the rows with a watchful eye, a grandmother who simply never slouched in her life, I would love to hear it. Leave it in the comments below. These stories deserve to be kept. And if you have ever felt that the past knew something worth remembering, there is a great deal more of it waiting for you on this channel. Subscribe, and I will see you next time with another rule that disappeared from polite company without anyone thinking to write it down first.